calls and the stuff. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking.
Yeah.
Because we got in.
It's like, yeah, wait, what just happened? Like you stopped.
Well, it started telling me it was recording stuff, and I was just, I was talking about my manager, and I was hoping he wouldn't see it.
100%. Yeah.
I have Dennis to back me up here. We're gonna start a riot. Nah, it's okay. I understood. Don't want to catch it on the recording.
I mean, I'll stop if like you want to finish your thought.
Well, now that you brought it up, no. All right, I'm gonna stop talking. Take it away, Kai, or Cobra Kai.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna get it to stick. It's a good thing, right?
I'm gonna have to like change my GitLab handle or something. I don't know. First one is read only. Thank you for everyone who participated in that, but feel free to take a look, watch the video, check the notes. Certainly more conversations to come, but I thought it was a good discussion worth just highlighting that it exists if you didn't make it. Number two, so this has been on my mind as we think about like the next iteration of the web IDE and whatever it ends up being. Part of that plan has always included like consolidating editing experiences and deprecating ACE, which is like has been around since before I got here. And then that never seemed hard until we started talking about snippets. And then we started talking about snippets, and suddenly there was like it uses the ACE editor thing. And so and we've mentioned this before, and I guess what I'd like want to get to kind of discussion here is like, in order to deprecate the ACE editor, to me, it feels like we still need some kind of single editing experience. I think for the snippets view, I think the single file editing experience makes more sense. I think there are benefits to the single file editing view inside of like those templated workflows for creating like GitLab CI files or Docker files or other things. Like I think some of those benefit from like single scoped views only because it's easier to design like a path around that. But I mean, I don't know, maybe they don't. But my question is like, would everyone, I guess, agree that like we need a single file editor of some kind, or like are there other options? And then like get through that. Like the next are kind of like, how do we do that?
One thing that comes to mind is we were a previous discussion we had was when you create a project and you're missing some of like those key files like license or README. We were talking about, and I think we did this, Dennis, where if you click on it, it opens it in the web IDE as opposed.
Not really. Like there is an issue that is like 6 months old or something, but we didn't do that, I think.
Okay, we were talking about it.
Yeah, there is an issue, but we have never had time to get to that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think UX really plays a part here, because we were thinking in the past when we were discussing the deprecating of the ACE editor. We were thinking about, let's make sure that the web IDE can do everything that the ACE editor can do, like applying file templates. And there's an epic for this. I'm just gonna put it here. To use web IDE for all file. What is this? File / code editing. But the idea would be super fast. You would be brought into a focused interface to edit that file, but it would allow you to add more files if you wanted it. But the experience of editing a single file would be super smooth and straightforward. And it would just be an added benefit that while you're here, you can also open another file. Because if you're opening like a code owner's file or a GitLab CI, whatever, you can then add multiple files, since the GitLab CI also allows the importing subsequent files, that makes sense to have multi-file editing in the experience of opening a GitLab CI YAML. So that was the view back then. And there's some UX research back then to back some of the changes that we're planning. So I think for the particular part of the snippets and that sort of experience, my bigger question is not so much about the single file versus multi-file, is more about the embedding of the editor, because right now the Web IDE is a full page thing, and for that particular thing to be reused, we need to find ways to kind of embed the IDE into other places of the application. And I think if we do that, then we'd be able to use that in several situations. That could be useful. Any thoughts on that?
No, thank you. I had maybe seen the Epic. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I had to go through a bunch of hoops to get to it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious, like, Marcelo, on your thoughts of, like, I know, like, we went through and redid the snippets UI, and it's largely based around, like, an embedded single file experience. Like, is that?
Yeah, I haven't seen actually the research, and it's the first time that I've seen the one that you just mentioned. So I'm definitely going to look into that as well. And I think the more we want to make, or the faster we want to make this the one unified editing experience, the faster we should also make the entire Web IDE easier to use. So it just makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, I think it all stems from the same direction. And Paul did some work on improving the bootstrapping of the Web IDE to make it faster a couple months ago. And I think from UX perspective, I think this comes back to Jithu's time, which is before your time, Marcel. So there's definitely some documentation of those things that they found. It will be in line with the findings we've been having, so much more recent. But it was all about the speed, because people didn't want to be like taking longer to edit a file. So as long as we can keep that experience as fast as with the ACE editor, we're good. And I think in terms of speed, we are in a much better shape than we were when we did the UX research back then. But you're right about the simplicity, about should we still have the staging and the committing as two separate steps, or should just everything be staged and you just like commit? So those simplifications will definitely benefit these scenarios we're discussing. It would be important to understand the required changes to replace the ACE editor, and then the other part is where can we reuse this, and what should we do? What should we prepare to be allowing that reuse? And speaking specifically about the snippets, I'm talking about like decoupling that and making the editor embeddable in some way, being able to use that in other contexts. And the other part is just replacing the links that link to the ACE editor, and then sunsetting that. Two separate things, I think.
Yeah, I'm also curious or how the transition will go, because if we say from the beginning on, we're going to completely remove the Web IDE button, make the edit button call the Web IDE, I don't know how much confusion that will cause. So we might have to also look into how do we want to announce that? Do we want to have like a little pop-up over the button to say we now have moved completely over to the Web IDE? I think there might also be some UX things that we can do to make this more obvious and to also give the reasons why we did this.
You mentioned, Andre, about performance stuff, and we did a little bit to improve that, but it is not perfect. And opening up the single file editor is still faster because it doesn't have to do all of the file tree setup that maybe there's some more performance. And I think that there is more performance stuff we could do, but we do talk about saying, hey, we're going to replace all of our single file editing with a single file editor. I think James was, when we were discussing this on the Epic, he was really pushing for these need to have the same startup performance. So I think that there's if we can decouple the editing bit, and we're definitely going to need to for snippets, I think that there's a strong use case for still keeping a single file editing experience. If for no other reason than just it removes some of the distractions for some users and some use cases.
Right. So the performance work we did already prioritizes bootstrapping the editor part before the tree, correct? I remember we discussing that.
Yeah, it's not perfect though, just because of some of the assumptions that the Web IDE makes, like based on some load order. But yeah, so it's doing a little bit of magic where before it was loading all the tree and then loading the editor. Now it loads both at the same time. For large projects, it still takes like 3 seconds, which isn't great. And I think that we could do things to improve it. It just will take some research.
Is it possible to have some kind of way where the user can communicate to us that they're only modifying a single file, and if they choose that option, we just don't load the tree?
Yeah, and I think that's something we could explore. And that's the idea of, hey, does it make sense to maybe does the single file editing experience make sense? And I think that, yeah, if we could tell that someone's going down this use case path, we could make optimizations like that. That's my perspective.
That makes sense to me.
In either case that you've maybe this is like point B. It sounds like in either case, right? Like we're not getting away from the case where like snippets needs the single file thing. So like, it sounds like either way we have to solve the single file editing issue experience, and then we can make decisions about the rest of the GitLab app, right? Like it's not like just because we replace this in snippets, we would need to replace it in the blob view, like the project view where you could click edit and open ACE. I think we would likely want to, but we could do it, I think, in a way where like build a single file version of Monaco editing only. And if it's works well there, we take that and then like start thinking about how to use it in other places. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And I think I like the rollout plan of looking at snippets first, because it's something we're already needing to do. I don't think we have any Vue ACE editor interop stuff, Andre or Dennis, if you've seen anything like that. So if we want to refactor snippets into Vue, well, I guess we're not doing the edit part of snippets yet, but either way, I see us needing to pull out that Monaco editor bit from the Web IDE and being able to reuse into snippets regardless. So yeah, I agree, and I like the plan that's laid out here.
Yeah, the question I have is between the order. If we're going to have a single file mode, a single editing mode, single file editing mode, if we have it before we extract this embeddable Monaco editor, or we're discussing not having a single file inside the Web IDE, because that begs the question. Like, if I'm thinking out loud as I think. So the thing is, if we have the embeddable Monaco something that we can then wrap a Vue component around, we're going to end up in a situation where we have a bunch of editors around the product to maintain. They have the core, but then around it, they use it in different ways. My question was, could we reach a state where the editor would be always the same in terms of UI? It's just like what it's saving to that would change in terms of UI. Would that make sense? Because then you would be just create a version of the Web IDE that it's embeddable in other parts of the product, specifying where to output it to, and then we can just tie that in with the integrations of each part. But then the editing part would be the same. Is that something possible, or would every scenario have their own UI around the editor? That's a question for everyone.
Did I capture your question correctly? I'm not sure if.
Yeah, you did. Thanks.
I think it's a good question, and I think will requires a little bit of the UX requirements around it to know the answer to it. One point is if we do have a single editor, we'd want to just find the right abstraction, I think, that works for both Web IDE and whatever other cases we need. And so based on that, whatever the constraints of that abstraction is could cause us to make different decisions there. Because we want to make sure that, hey, if I make a change to the header of the Web IDE editor, because users prefer this kind of file editing experience, we want to kind of do something similar across GitLab.
Would you want to understand those things prior to working on this? Like is the question you would like to know potentially where else we might want to use a single file editor or change editing experiences before you start working on before we start working on the thing that we end up using in snippets, or do we want to let snippets guide us and then iterate after that?
I'm a fan of letting snippets guide us and iterating afterwards, because I think we'll totally over-engineer it if we try to not. I'll over-engineer it if we want to find the editor that solves every potential problem. So, yeah.
So with that comes a question. Snippets right now is single file, but we are going towards multi-file, right, Kai? Wasn't that like a very heavy request?
The plan is to do multiple files. The designs for multiple files are currently multiple single file editing experiences, because that is in line with what the standard gists do, is it's multiple single file editing experiences. Right. I think given the way that like gists tend to work, I think if I were to think about like my own usage or looking at like just if you go through like Explore or whatever there, like most people only use one file. And so the idea of like having an add file button and like loading another window below feels like less burdensome than like tossing them into something that like natively supports multiple files. Just like, that'd be my hot take on like the UX experience. Is like, I think like if you show file tree view and other stuff, they're going to feel committed to like do more stuff.
Yeah. I was kind of envisioning a multi-file, but then UI for them, then it's snippets. But yes, then everybody would go through that multi-file without even needing a multi-file. I think that makes sense. What I'm thinking in the future is like being able to grab that snippet and do something like CodePen does, like a client-side preview using the Code Sandbox, all that. That still makes sense with the multiple single file editors. All of that still makes sense. I think potentially. I'm trying to think if we could have a shortcut by using if we had a single editor with multiple files inside, we could totally leverage the Web IDE implementation of the Code Sandbox preview out of the box. So there's advantages, pros and cons. Taking a look at what Marcel just shared now.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's something we,
right.
I definitely need to think about more. I'd say like, you're right, intent of snippets, I think long-term is like, maybe we get to like a CodePen built into GitLab, right? Where people can do those things. I don't think we've thought about it enough to
sure.
give you an answer at all on that.
I'm going to share my screen just since we are recording this for what Marcel just shared on the chat.
Thank you, Paul.
This sketch about a new snippet redesign and showing the multi-file approach. And this is what you're describing just as like, right?
Yeah. This is the multiple single file editing experience.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go.
In the top navbar, you can even move back one file to number 3 of 7.
What?
And then you see, awesome, huh? Sketch Cloud. But then you can see how this would usually look when you only have one file, and you can add multiple other ones. So just to give you all some background.
It's really interesting. And it makes me, as if I'm a user of snippets, like it's nice how the web IDE keeps files I'm not interested in, tucked behind the file tree. This one, I'm going to see all the files at once. And it's interesting because it's, now poses the question for me as a developer, hey, if I'm noticing my complexity of my snippets start to increase, and I don't want to see all the files at once, maybe I need to just create a project. Yeah, I'm not a huge, for me personally, I'm not a huge fan of seeing them all at once. But I can see in some cases it's more simple and helpful. But that's interesting.
It's for the case of it's a snippet, they're all related, that sort of thing. So you wouldn't be writing like hundreds of lines here usually. And if you are, I mean, it wasn't built for that. I did want to raise a possibility here, which would be go to 3 out of 7, Paul, please. Thank you. So if this view there in the file section would show, imagine an embedded web IDE, but with single file editing mode activated, it would look something like this without the file tree, just like a little logo, something saying that it's the IDE, whatever. So you'd be editing the file, then you'd have a button to add a new file, similar to this, but then that would kick in the tree view of the web IDE, and then you would just have tabs for multiple files. But until then, you have a single file. This is kind of mixing the two topics we're discussing today, which is embeddable IDE and single file all at once in the same view. My question is, does this make sense? And the other is there any other places we could use this pattern?
I love that idea. It's been something like that I had also thought about, like wondering if like there's a version of the IDE that like defaults into single file mode for most edits, and then like an expandable file tree, like if you decide you need a second file somehow, right? Like something that like lets us keep like one editor, and like you think about like going into like the CI YAML files, like I think a good example, right? Like you go into that in single file view, and then like if you have to add another file because like you're doing an include, like suddenly like the file tree shows up and you get your tabs, and like you're in a much better editing experience. I intentionally held back on talking about that only because like I felt like it was going to create this like bigger rewrite of things, but I think it's I love it, and I think it's something we should explore.
And when it comes to other users for this behavior, it's like getting back to the first question from Paul, like those buttons, when you create a new project and you click, for example, add README, you get to the single file mode, and then you sort of evolve your project. You keep adding files there. So you switch to multiple files mode. So that's in line with this behavior, I guess.
That's true.
But
so I guess that would work for the single file editing, which is now done with the ACE. It could be a single file editing mode on the full web IDE as well. So it could be something that we approach in two threads. One is making the web IDE embeddable. The other is making a single file mode for the IDE. And then that will come through the embeddable part.
On the snippets, I actually have one comment that I even up to today haven't thought about. Files, as you can see here, don't have to have a file name. Would that be a problem in the web IDE?
Not for the single file. I think in the single file would be able to support that whatever's the output is the output that is going to be thrown to the outside shell. Right, Paul, Dennis? The single file embeddable, we can definitely have a way for the component to export content and not have a file name. But then as soon as you go into multiple files, you probably need a name.
I think it depends on the area of usage. Like if you're technically, if you're in the process of creating a new project, and then you have to give names to the files. If you're in the process of using it for snippets, then you're totally fine without the name, right? I think this all depends on the way we handle these files. Like if you're in the single file mode, you create a file. Where does this file go? If like we are talking about snippets and project now. So project, when you create file in a single mode within a project, it goes into the project. When you create this, when you create this in the snippets context, then it goes to the snippets, right? But I think there is no problem with not giving name to the file, because it all depends on the area of usage. Like, where do we store the things?
So the export would be like an array of file objects that could or could not have the file name. I would make that something for the embeddable web ID, whereas the web ID to build projects still has that requirement, but the embeddable could be optional file name. So it's something for us to build when we build the embedded web ID, but that's possible, I think. Should we keep discussing this, or should we move back to this at this point, and then we go back to it whenever we can?
I think my question, I would like to, in 12.6, right, I think we're at a point in capacity where we've got some room to start going down the snippets path. And so I'd like to understand, I know one of the things Paul has proposed, which was the refactor into Vue, in order to like start working as like a setup for that. And I think largely that made sense to you, Andre. I'm not sure, Dennis, if you've seen that. So like,
yes.
Okay. The question then becomes like, we're going to refactor to Vue. We also at some point need to work on, it sounds like, I think we're all in agreement that we need to work on some kind of embeddable single file version of this. And then like the next use cases and how we deal with like tabs or multiple files, like we'll think about later, but like at the very least, we've got to be able to match like what we would see in snippets. And then we want to start using, like, basically we'll get to beta this component into snippets and see how it functions there, right, before we take it anywhere else. The question would be like, what do we need in terms of like discovery issues or design work in order to like potentially start working on this in the next iteration?
It can be answered in the use case of when we get to doing the multi-file snippets. So talking about redesign, doing the refactor to Vue, that's scoped for the versioned snippets because it's only needed really just for the showing a snippet page. Version snippets isn't necessarily a requirement for, doesn't have any scope with front-end scope for the edit page, because that's all the backend can just handle that. So what I'd propose would be when we actually start implementing the use case for multi-file snippets, let's use those requirements then to drive, what's the right abstraction here? Do we need to have names for these things, or do we want to show a tree here or whatever? So if we plan on doing version snippets first, I think that we can actually kind of defer this decision later. That's my thoughts.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with that. I think we can start building the versioned snippets first, but once we have the editing, then everything has to be. So the discovery, to your question, Kai, the discovery part should be invested on the multi-file snippets, and then we will derive our decisions from there. It will be important to keep a good flow between Marcel and the front end about what would a web ID look like or possibly look like embedded, just to not like trying to overreach and try to redesign everything. There are significant technical challenges to do this. So the web ID would now need to support some flow which is not Git based, would need to just export to the outer shell where it's embeddable. But I feel like that's doable and something that could be very useful in several cases.
Okay, so I just want to play that back. So 12.6, we shouldn't do 12.6. We're not thinking about like the single file editor from like an engineering perspective, but the takeaway would be that Marcel and I should go away and start thinking about like what we want those editing experiences to look like with like a single or a column thing, and try and come back with like, so like potentially in 12.7, we've got a better set of requirements for you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you. Sorry to totally occupy 30 minutes.
Any urgent other topics that we should cover today? I have the status updated for the Elasticsearch. Dennis, possibility of running a test instance. Are you blocked by that, Dennis?
I'm not sure, Marcus. Are we?
It would just be great to get this information as soon as possible. Like, do we really need this? I think we do. And
yes, we definitely need this for the review process, so that reviewers wouldn't need to set up Elasticsearch locally and add like several indices. That would help review process and us significantly, because
so I would add that Himanshu has already done a bunch of experiments about running an instance on GCP off of a branch instead of merging. And I think that's very valuable here. So my suggestion would be to reach out to him and see he can help you out in setting that up. So basically, like, there's a job, CI job, that creates a deb package that can use to install that on a GCP. And that still requires knowledge on setting up the Elasticsearch and all that. That I will leave that, Marcus, if you can sort that out, or find someone to help you out sorting out the Elasticsearch configuration and everything. But the GCP instance, putting that to run, Himanshu can definitely help you out there.
Okay, great. I'll talk to him.
And then on Elasticsearch side, like the SRE is Mikhail Wasolinsky or something. Right.
Okay, so definitely
Mikhail.
that person.
Yeah, he would be able to like help you from like an infrastructure Elasticsearch standpoint.
Who's that
Other
again?
than Mikhail, he's an SRE. Michael Mikhail, I think. Lewinsky. I'm totally butchering that. And it's on video. Great. He is the SRE that like runs the production clusters for Elasticsearch, or has set those up. I will say this, for production, we use the hosted version of Elastic Cloud. So it may be as simple as like asking how we could get like another like hosted version of like the Elastic as a service. That's what we use, the SaaS version of Elastic in production. We don't use we don't configure and run our own Elasticsearch clusters.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I guess that's basically the urgent parts. Let's just make sure that we read the read-onlys, and we're already 3 minutes over time. Anything else?
No, I'm good. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Later.